Okay, so we want to continue today with part 6 of our interpersonal communication discussion, specifically on mindful listening. Whether you think about nurses, salespeople, doctors, teachers, customer service personnel, tech assistants, lawyers, judges, researchers, marketing professionals, mechanics, service technicians, and just about every other profession in the world, they deal with interacting with people. Very few professions are solely the hermit kind of professions where we don't deal with people. And in business, it is the person who listens to the needs of others and what the messages are really about. Those are the ones that are marked with success either in business or in life. I want you to think for a moment about the current situation in healthcare that we have in Western society today. You go to see a doctor. When you go to see a doctor, you might go in, you might sign in, you might go to a waiting room. Now, depending upon how long you wait, that's another story entirely, but it certainly can affect how your attitude seems to be composed of by the time you get to the examination room. By the time you get to the examination room, who is normally the person that's going to take care of you? The nurse, a physician's assistant, or some other kind of aide who's going to listen to your complaint. Why are you here? What are your symptoms? And what do you need to see the doctor about today? Then the nurse or the physician's assistant or whoever it might be is going to take some data points on you. Perhaps your blood pressure, perhaps your pulse, might listen to your respiration, make some notes on your chart, whether it's a computer version of a chart or whether it's a piece of paper and a file. And that person who has spent some time with you will then leave, put either the computer, if it's an iPad or something along those lines, or the file on the outside of the door somehow, close the door and leave. Western medicine, being what it is very scientific and very formulaic. When the doctor sees on the chart, before they go to see you, that you have these symptoms that you are reporting. These are your data points, your blood pressure, your pulse, your respiratory rate, or whatever else that they may have taken. The doctor already knows, based on the formulaic approach to science in Western medicine, this is probably what you have, and this is what I'm going to do about it. This is what I'm going to treat it with. This is what I'm going to prescribe for you. Having said that, how much time does the doctor take when he comes into the examination room? The doctor's going to come into the examination room, might say hello, might shake your hand, going to make sure that this is indeed your name, verify the file, might double check one or two of those data points to double check the work of the aide who came before, and then pretty much do whatever he had already planned or she had already planned, give you that prescription, give you that treatment, and move on to the next room. Now, who's happy with that? Typically, very few people are happy with that. How long did I wait in the waiting room? How long did I actually get to spend with the doctor who I think I'm paying for? Given a choice, how many of those patients will stay with that doctor? Given the choice. There are some constraints, of course, with insurance, convenience factor, if the doctor's within walking distance, the only doctor in town. So there are some possible constraints that would say, I have to use this doctor. But given the choice, is this the doctor I'm going to stay with, or that doctor has a reputation for spending a little more time with their patient and listening? Where am I going? The likelihood is I'm going to the person who has a better reputation for listening. And the fact is, the same thing holds true for the person who works on our hair, the dentist we might go to, the auto mechanic we might see, the person we invite into our home to fix and maintain our HVAC systems. It doesn't really matter what the business is. healthcare, or sandwiches, if we get the impression that people really care because they've been able to master the idea of listening, really listening, we are more likely to do business, to be their friend, to interact by choice. We cannot underestimate the power of listening, and we can't listen if we're always doing the talking. Receiving messages, or the decoding process, you might remember from our discussion in the first part of this series that we talked about the communication model and the idea of receiving and decoding messages. Oftentimes, this is more important than actually creating messages, because people want to believe that they have not only been heard, but really listened to. Now, hearing is a simple matter. It's a physiological process where sound waves hit our eardrums. Listening, however, is that complex process that consists first off of being mindful. Hearing is part of the listening process. Selecting and organizing information, interpreting communication, responding, and remembering. So listening is a very different process from simply hearing. And hearing is simply a physiological perception, a physiological process. You know, even the Chinese, which is probably the longest standing civilization, culture, longest continuous surviving culture in the world. In ancient Chinese script, now this is not simplified Chinese, but ancient Chinese script, they even had that figured out. The symbol for listening in the ancient Chinese script, not the simplified Chinese that's current today, but the ancient Chinese script is made up of the three symbols of heart, eyes, and ears. And so to recognize even that early on in civilization, that listening takes a complete focus, is that important. So what is the listening process? Well, as I already stated, we started off with the idea of being mindful. Being mindful means being fully present in the moment. That means no smartphones. You know, how often do we use our smartphones, and how often do we put them right on our tables when we're eating lunch with someone, or on the desk when we're attending a lecture, or somewhere very close by, no matter what else is going on? Some of us have become overly attached to those leashes. I mean, cell phones. Some of us have become so attached that we might be having the most important conversation with our significant other that we could possibly have, and when that buzzer rings on our phone, or it vibrates, or it says or does something to indicate we have a text message, we immediately stop what we're doing because we're telling the person we're having a conversation with that this, whatever's on this phone, is more important than the conversation we're having here. We're not listening mindfully. Mindful listening means I'm fully present in the moment. Distractions are gone. I've specifically have gone out of my way to limit or remove distractions, because this conversation that we're having is the most important thing that could be happening to me at the present time, that I am fully present here, being mindful. The second part of that process is physically receiving messages. Now, we already talked about the idea of hearing being a physiological process where sound waves hit the eardrums. But what if that conversation is on the smartphone? It means that we're receiving texts and things. I'm still receiving the messages. In this case, receiving through the eyes, aren't I? So whatever the channel might be, I physically need to be receiving those messages. The third step in the listening process is selecting and organizing information. Now, you might remember from a previous discussion, we spent a lot of time talking about perception and our own filters, and recognizing that there are some things that are within the normal range of expectancy that we might see them and dismiss them. You were here last week. And when you were here last week, you were wearing clothes. If I ask you what color was the shirt that this person was wearing over here, the likelihood is you wouldn't remember it all. Why? Because there wasn't anything special about it, but if there was something special about it that was outside our range of expectancy, or outside of what we might consider normal, it may have piqued our interest and we would have paid attention. Selecting and organizing information. What information am I selecting? Now, the previous discussion we talked about being able to choose information because I specifically wanted to pay attention to things. Or if it's outside the range of expectancy. Maybe the shirt color was really, really a funny, funky color. And I remembered it because of that. Maybe they weren't wearing a shirt at all. And I would certainly remember because of that. A couple of years back, I had a student who every week would arrive to class with a different hair color. Everybody paid attention. Why? Because it wasn't normal hair color. Fuchsia, green, blue, purple, pink. And everybody started playing the guessing game. What color next week? Things that are loud, intense, or unusual, we have a tendency to select more quickly, which also leads us to believe that things may be overlooked if they're soft-spoken, may be overlooked if they're muted colors. So if that's the case, then we need to focus our mind on what am I paying attention to, just as we discussed in our discussion on perception. So I need to select and organize the information. The next is to interpret the communication. We are creatures of habit, and we are creatures of a worldview perspective. Whether it's our religion or our culture, our age or popular culture, we see things through a very specific lens. It's not the same lens that everyone else sees things through. And people from a different perspective will see things and interpret them from slightly different points of view. One of the greatest gifts we can give anyone when we're truly listening to them is to withhold our perspective and attempt to see things from a dual perspective. Can I see things the same way you do if you're telling me something and explaining it to me and trying to give me your point of view? Yeah, it doesn't mean I have to agree and immediately adopt that view. It means that I can suspend mine for the moment and try and see things, if you will, through your eyes. Can I see it the way you do? Interpret the communication as the person who is telling it to you sees it, interprets it, views it. Finally, the last two steps are responding and remembering. How I choose to respond essentially symbolizes my interest in what you're saying. How important is it? Am I dismissing it as not very important? Then I've disrespected the person who chose to speak to me. Am I paying very close attention? Am I offering advice? You know, remember, of course, that we talked again in a previous discussion. Men and women in Western cultures are raised differently, and they're raised differently to speak about different things, and as a consequence, they're also raised to listen in different ways. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to everyone within the culture, but remember, generally speaking, women are raised with toys that are socialization toys, aren't they? Dolls. What do dolls do? We imagine that they talk to each other. And we create the conversation. Tea sets. What are cookware and tea sets? What are those for? To put those dolls around and have a party. And we talk to each other. And we create the conversation. We talk about what the things we feel, we talk about the things we think about. And as a consequence, girls are raised into women who are expert at small talk, talking about one's feelings, and support, social support. Men, on the other hand, when they are boys, are given toys that are very independent-oriented, task-oriented, and conquer-oriented. They're given dolls too, aren't they? Except we call them G.I. Joes, soldiers. We call them superheroes, robots. And what are their tasks? To win, to destroy, to beat the others, to conquer. We're given, as boys, often, not all, but often, tools to create, to build, to fix. And by the time they become men, when they hear about a problem, what is their instinct? Well, let me tell you how I'd fix it. And they're going to give you instructions. This is how you beat that problem. This is how you fix that problem. Why in the world would you tell me if you didn't want my advice on how to fix it? Generally speaking, that's how men think initially. And so, isn't it any wonder that one of the biggest problems that happen when men and women get together in conversation is that they have trouble adapting to each other's listening styles because they've developed different talking styles. Responding. It symbolizes that interest. Well, how are you going to respond? And have you been able to see truly from the other person's perspective that they really didn't want to be told how to fix it? They wanted to vent. They wanted to just share their feelings about it. They didn't want instruction. If a guy comes to a girl and says, I need to talk to you about this problem, sometimes he feels let down if she didn't offer a possible solution. Why would he talk to you if he didn't want your take on it? That's tough. We live in a very complex society. And finally, the last step in the process of listening is remembering. You have a spat, a quarrel, an argument with your significant other, and then the next day, your significant other says to you, now you remember what we talked about yesterday. What are you going to do today? All of a sudden, your mind goes through. You have no idea, and yet you might have been completely in the moment during that argument. But unless you can remember the importance and the significance of what that argument was about and what you should do about it, have you really listened? I'm going to suggest to you the answer is no. If you cannot remember for the following day, the answer is no. And so remembering is the last and sixth step in the process. So what are the obstacles to listening? We've got lots. We've got lots. Externally, we have what we might call message overload. During your day, you are bombarded with an incredible number of messages. Whether it's from your class lectures, whether it's from conversations with family and friends, whether it's from the TV, and some people in some families have the TV on 24 hours a day. Whether it's from a radio, whether it's from your cell or smartphone, text messaging, or Facebook, We are constantly bombarded with messages. How in the world do we figure out what's important? This is an obstacle to actually focusing and being mindful, of course. How about message complexity? How often do we speak to someone or we're talking to someone and they start talking about technical jargon? And you're wondering, I don't even understand what that means. Slang, idioms. For example, it might even be as simple as what we might consider simple, but the complexity of a complex sentence using big words to learners of English who speak a foreign language. So English is there, learning English as a second language, and you're speaking in much higher vocabulary, levels of vocabulary, than what they're accustomed to. So not only do they have to deal now with what the actual conversation is about, but now they're also having to deal with this other level of what do those specific words mean? At one point, I had a group of Chinese teachers in America, in the United States, when I was in Illinois. And we had a number of high school English and grade school English teachers who got an English degree from a Chinese university, who got a teaching certificate, and who were teaching at high schools and grade schools. And they came over because I can do the same thing here, right? I can get, for example, a bachelor's degree in German. I can get a teaching certificate. And I could also start teaching German in a high school or a grade school without ever having gone to a culture that speaks German. I know it academically. I know the technical issues involved. But do I really understand the culture that speaks it? Perhaps not. And so this is what we were doing. We're bringing a lot of English teachers who had never been in a culture that practiced and spoke English to the United States. We were in Illinois at the time. And we take them on shopping trips, and we take them to malls and restaurants and places around town so that they could go and experience and interact. And then we brief them later, debrief them later and talk about their experiences and what happened with the interactions. And it might be as simple as completely getting lost, for example, when one of them was buying a tennis racket from a sporting goods store to take back to China for a family member, was having a conversation with the clerk trying to pay them for the tennis racket. And the conversation that they were having, at one point the clerk said to the teacher, "I don't know, you lost me." Which really confused the teacher, who hadn't had experience in an American English-speaking culture. Came back later and asked the question, "How could I have lost him? He was standing right in front of me." Message complexity, slang, techno-jargon, higher levels of vocabulary than we might be used to. Maybe I'm talking mathematics or philosophy, and I'm trying to refer to those things in our conversation, and you're not that far advanced in mathematics or philosophy. And that can have a different an impact. The third external obstacle we want to talk about is noise. And we also talked about noise in our first discussion in interpersonal communication, with the respect that physical noise exists and it's also an obstacle. If there's construction going on outside the building so loud that we have trouble actually hearing each other, is that an obstacle to understanding the communication? Of course it is. Of course it is. If we're at a rock concert and you're trying to tell me something, and we're near the speakers at a rock concert, there's no way that I'm going to be able to even hear what you have to say because there's too much else going into my ears. You might remember this as physical noise or even environmental noise from a previous discussion. Internal obstacles also exist. Preoccupation being one of them. What if you are preoccupied, for example, with the math exam you're taking in the next hour after this class, after this lecture, after this discussion? Is there any way that you are completely mindful of our discussion right now? Probably not if you really care about that math exam. There's a good chance you're still running formulas, mathematical formulas in the back of your head. And you're kind of going over them little by little, even while you're sitting listening to me. You're getting ready to give a speech in the next class. There's a good chance you're kind of going over your outline in the back of your head and covering various points of your presentation that you intend to give. Are you completely in the moment and mindful now if that's happening? No, you're preoccupied. Preoccupation can certainly be one of those internal obstacles that causes us not to be able to be mindful in our listening. Prejudgment. You're getting ready to have a conversation with someone who wants to talk to you about a topic that you have already thought about and dismissed and don't care for or are violently opposed against. Let's call it something in politics. It's very easy to find something in politics that we don't agree with. Somebody wants to talk to you about that. Have we already prejudged the conversation that we are not able to hear and listen mindfully to anything new and interesting and rational they might have to add? It's quite possible. Quite possible. Between the two of those, we might certainly call that psychological noise, might we? There's something about our psychology, our cognitive function that is excluding us from being completely mindful in the listening process. The fourth obstacle internally we might deal with is reacting to emotionally loaded language. Now there's lots of words that could be used that might cause us to react emotionally, especially if they are words that attack our sexual orientation, our gender, our ethnicity, our age, and I can go on. But you know, there might also be some emotionally loaded language in connotations that are not meant to be emotionally loaded initially. This is why reporters often have a very difficult time being completely objective, and why it's almost nearly impossible to be completely objective. Because I might even use the word blue in a sentence, and that almost seems very neutral. I'm talking about a color, and yet from the connotation point of view, blue might have very personal and negative connotations to you. Maybe when I was a child, I was punished and disciplined by my parents with a big blue paddle. And whenever I hear the word blue, it brings back images of that paddle, and it makes me kind of anxious. Well, if that's the case, is blue emotionally loaded for you? Of course it is. Of course it is. So it's possible that we are reacting emotionally to some of the words that are being used that blocks us from being fully mindful in the discussion, in the conversation, and the communication interaction. And so we might also refer to that as emotional noise. Lack of effort is the next. Lack of effort can come from a number of different ways, right? I can be completely disinterested in the topic or the person, and as such not willing to give the effort involved. I might have physiological noise issues. I might have a cold. I might be taking medicine that kind of makes me a little fuzzy, and I'm not able to be fully mindful. Antihistamines do that to me. So I might have physiological noise that actually results in a lack of effort. Because being completely mindful, that's hard work. Sometimes it's more exhausting to really pay attention, concentrated attention, mindful listening, hours and hours a day, especially if you have multiple classes that are very difficult for you, that you're attending a number of different discussions, a number of different lectures as a student that you really need to focus on. By the end of the day, you're exhausted. It's hard work. And finally, a failure to adapt to listening styles. You know, we're going to talk about 3 listening styles today. Listening for pleasure, listening for information, and listening for support. And so, when we actually are not adapting to the correct purpose for which we should be listening, we can certainly have a mindful block, if you will. and have an obstacle to being completely mindful for our purpose. You know, sometimes people have a tendency not to listen, but have to be in the communication situation anyway. They have to be in the communication situation anyway. And so we might engage in various forms of non-listening. And perhaps we've met people who fit this bill. The first being pseudo-listening. Pseudo-listening is just pretending to listen. Maybe orienting our body toward the other communicator, maybe even nodding our head, but in our minds we're calculating our laundry list. We're figuring out where we're going after this communication interaction is over. Might be monopolizing. Perhaps we've met people like this who will always turn the conversation around. Even though they pretend and will tell you that they're listening, they always have a tendency to turn the conversation back around so that they can talk about themselves. The bad joke that I often use at this point is the person, for example, that I've seen in the situation comedy on television who says, after talking at length about themselves, looks at the person they're talking to and says, well, enough about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? And exactly how did that not continue to monopolize the conversation? And the point is, it still does. Even though they perhaps give the impression, or try to give the impression, that they're showing some interest in the other individual. Selective listening being the third form of non-listening, which is where we focus only on selected parts of the communication. We screen out the parts of the message that we don't really care about, and that we don't, maybe that we disagree with, and we focus directly in on the parts that we do care about. Mother says to the child, clean your room and then you can go out and play. Where are you going to find the child? Out playing. Has the room been cleaned? Probably not. Because we were selectively focusing on the part that I want to pay attention to. Well, we do this with a lot of people sometimes as well, when we are really interested in something and focusing not on others. Defensive listening being the fourth. This is where we're perceiving attacks and criticism where there isn't one. Remember, of course, that when we talked about communication in a previous discussion, we talked about the idea that communication can be intentional or it can be unintentional. When we have unintentional communication, it means the receiver, the perceiver, the decoder, or the listener, is decoding attacks where there were none intended by the encoder, by the creator of the message. And so defensive listening is where I'm actually trying to see and finding hostile undertones and criticism where none exist, and so I'm listening with the understanding that I'm getting ready to defend myself, and so I can't be mindful of the conversation whatsoever. Ambushing takes that one step further. Ambushing being the next form of non-listening. This is where I'm actually listening carefully for the speaker to slip up, for the speaker to make a mistake so I can pounce. Even if the mistake they made is just a very small part, I make that the focus of my response, not the whole bit of communication or rationale that they're trying to relay to you. Only the bit that I can attack. And so I do. Ambushing is listening for the mere purpose of finding that one thing or a couple of things that I can pounce on, that I can jump on. And finally, literal listening. Literal listening is where I'm paying more attention to the content level of the meaning and ignoring the relationship level of the meaning. Your significant other says to you, why don't we pick a very special place for dinner tonight? And you are hearing that and listening to that, and you interpret that to mean you get to pick the place, and you're going to go pick some place that has a great menu, and you're getting treated for dinner. But were you listening to the content, depending upon the relationship level, depending upon the context of the relationship at that moment. Remember, meaning lies within people. That doesn't lie within words. Meaning lies in people. What do they mean by that? Well, at the relationship level, that particular request may have been, find a restaurant where we can talk, because this is either going to be the reestablishment of the commitment of our relationship or the end of it. And if you don't get that message, you could get caught blindsided. Are you paying attention to the relationship level of what is being said? The context level. My mother used to say to me when I was young, pick up your floor and you can go out and play. When she said pick up your floor, what she meant was pick all the toys and things up off the floor of your bedroom and put them away. And what did I do? I paid attention to the literal meaning as a child. I went in, picked everything up off the floor, tossed it on the bed, and went out to play. You might guess that didn't make her very happy. Meanings lie within people, they don't lie within words. My mother finally began to say to me the often repeated mantra that you've heard me say to you a number of times, meaning lies within people, not within words, but as she said it, do what I mean, not what I say. Because she was well aware that I knew what was meant by the request. And that perhaps the words didn't come out exactly as was meant, but she knew that meaning lies within people, not within words, and that the meaning was obvious, and that perhaps I was trying to get away with something, and of course I was. So if we are mindful, and learning to be mindful in our listening, we need to also recognize that there are three main styles of listening that we need to adapt to. And we're going to talk real briefly about the styles of listening for pleasure, listening for information, and listening to support others. The first is listening for pleasure. Is there going to be a test on something that you're listening for pleasure? Probably not. Is there going to be any accountability afterwards? Probably not. So what do you need to do to prepare? Physically be present, right? This might be because you're going to a play to enjoy. You bought a movie ticket, you're going to go watch a movie. You're going to a concert, you're putting your music on the radio. Whatever it might be, there's no accountability or no reason to remember it later. There's no reason to have accomplished anything other than your own pleasure. Can this be done passively? Maybe. It's certainly possible. And as such, I'm going to relax. Listening for pleasure can be that easy, and should be that easy. How about listening for information? Listening for information is about focusing on gaining and evaluating ideas, facts, opinions, reasons, research, etc. As such, we need to be mindful, and we don't need to let our mind wander. Put the cell phones away. Put the smartphones away. Get off Facebook. Get off the internet. Shut the window if there's too much noise outside. Being mindful means we need to be able to focus our attention on the information specific that we're being given. So control obstacles. Ask questions. You know, if you don't understand something that's being told to you, ask questions for clarification so that you understand it correctly. If you think you understand it correctly, ask the questions anyway. Verify your understanding. Engage the information that you're receiving so that you know that you are receiving accurate information and that you understand it as it's being relayed. Use aids to recall. What are aids to recall? First, repeat things. Repeat things. The more you repeat things, of course, the more you will remember. The more you will remember, the more you will learn. take that one step further. You really want to make sure you understand something? Find somebody who doesn't know the information and teach them. Because you have to repeat it in such a way that they understand it. And if you can repeat it to the point that they understand it, you will have completely solidified your own understanding. Teach someone else the information. When we talk about mnemonics, we talk about often these aids to recall things. How about, for example, the musical notes on a music staff? How do we remember the notes by letter? Well, what we've done, for the spaces, for instance, you might recall that the spaces on a particular staff are F-A-C-E, going from the bottom to the top. Spells the word face if I put them together. And so we use that as a mnemonic. I know the word face, and I know, therefore, I can spread out the notes. What about the lines? Here I need to remember the letters, so perhaps I remember a sentence. By remembering the sentence, that I take the first letter from each word in the sentence, I've got what I need, and it was easier for me to remember the sentence, right? Every good boy does fine. And now I can take the first letters and count the notes up the lines from the bottom to the top. And the same holds true if I want, for example, to remember other things by creating, for example, words instead of face, meaning I want to remember F-A-C-E. What if I created a word that helps me remember the whole sentence or the words that go along with it? So I take the first letter of, and I do this. For example, how do I remember the 5 Great Lakes in North America? And some of you are thinking very hard back to your primary school days and going, what was that? It's the word homes, H-O-M-E-S. And so then I can take the word homes and go H-O-M-E-S. So each letter, H, Huron, O, Ontario, M, Michigan, E, Erie, S, Superior. And I remembered the 5 Great Lakes of North America. And we do the same for things like, how do I remember the order of the colors of the rainbow? And things of this nature. Okay, so use aids to recall. And finally, for adapting to listening for information, organize the information. When somebody's talking about various things, are they talking about things that can be put into categories? And can I remember the broad categories? For example, I'm giving you all this information about listening for information, and I'm going to give you information about listening to support others. Can you remember that it's divided now in 3, listening for pleasure, listening for information, and listening for supporting others, and then start thinking about the categories, the steps in between for each one? Or does it all seem like one big mess to you? If it all seems like one big mess to you, you're not working on organizing the information well. So find a way. If someone's coming to talk to you about short-term and long-term goals and complaining about their classes, but they're only 20 years old, and then they start complaining about their life career goals and their worry over it, well, at 20 years old, when we're talking about career goals, we're talking about long-term career goals. But if I'm complaining about classes, I'm talking about short-term career goals. Can I talk about the idea that there must be a problem between those 2 categories? And now remember broad strokes, short-term goals, long-term goals, and then kind of remember some of the pieces that go along with it. So organize the information into ways that make sense. Okay, so that was listening for pleasure and listening for information. Let's talk about listening to support others. Here we're talking about, again, being mindful, but being mindful in a different way. I'm not paying attention specifically on facts and figures and research. I'm paying more attention to the person. I'm being mindful of the relationship level of things here, and I'm trying to determine the context in which something is being said rather than the content specific. So a different kind of mindfulness is needed. What lies between the words? What lies behind the words? Next, we should be careful of expressing judgment, at least initially. Remember, of course, that being able to support others in good mindful listening means that we're suspending judgment and evaluation. Can I be mindful in the respect that I see things through the way you're expressing them and your point of view, having a dual perspective? If I can, then there's no point in my evaluating it, whatever you're telling me, through my cultural and worldview lens and saying, well, to me that just sounds stupid, or whatever it might be. Well, you need to do this. Unless we're specifically being asked for our evaluation. Unless we're specifically being asked. And in cases of ethical or moral dilemmas, oftentimes we might be asked, what would you do? But I wouldn't go and judge that concept and evaluate and then express that opinion specifically unless you're asked. Because the whole idea here is to understand the other person's perspective. How do I verify that I understand their perspective? The first way is to paraphrase. So they've expressed all these major concerns to you in detail. A paraphrase might simply be, so you're telling me that you're very frustrated with the current situation that you're experiencing in your family life. That's a very big difference than parroting. We don't want to get caught parroting or mimicking or repeating back everything that was just said like a parrot back to the person who just said it. Okay, that's not paraphrasing, and sometimes that's demeaning and insulting. Use minimal encouragement. How do I do that? As I'm looking at somebody and having a conversation, to indicate to them that I am fully present in the moment, I might use those utterances like, go on. All right, tell me more. I might move into the next section here of asking questions. How do you feel about that in particular? How does that make you feel? What do you think you want to do about that? But what you're doing is you're indicating to the other person that yes, you are mindful to the situation, you are here. You are physically and mentally present at this moment and allowing them to continue and encouraging them to do so. And then express support. Remember, of course, we talked about gender communication a little bit. Okay? What is it the person wants? Does the person want support by way of saying, here's my advice? Or does the person want support by just saying, I understand, I'm here if you want to talk, give them the opportunity to vent, express their thoughts, whatever the case might be. So what are the guidelines to effective listening? 1, be mindful. We've talked about this, and this is the theme of the entire discussion today. Mindfulness is a choice to be wholly present to an experience. Most of us like to think that we can do so many things at the same time that it doesn't matter, and we have forgotten about the whole mindful idea. And in fact, media frenzy in popular culture reinforces the idea that we need not be mindful for anything. What do I mean by that? If you sit down and watch TV, commercials come at such a machine gun pace, and even the television shows that many of us will watch come at such a machine gun pace that scenes change, colors change, characters change, dialogue is very fast. That it's almost providing us what the experience might be like to have attention deficit disorder, where our focus just keeps changing. Thank you, media. And it changes again and again and again so rapidly that we begin to think we don't need to be mindful completely to the present moment as much as what we need to do is just keep looking and doing so many things at the same time. It's a rare gift to someone when you are completely mindful to any situation. When we listen for pleasure, we should be mindful and minimize distractions so that we can derive as much enjoyment as possible out of the experience. When we listen for information, we should be mindful of a critical attitude, evaluation of the material, focus on the content, specifically the content, and the research. And yet, when we are being mindful and listening to support, we should focus on things that are being not said, the things that are said between the lines, the things that are said behind in the context of the situation, and not necessarily in the words themselves and in the content.